Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dr. David Harper is a health educator and cancer researcher and has studied the impact of diet on human health for many years. The culmination of that extensive work is the BioDiet, a ketogenic food regimen that he and his wife began in 2012. The significant weight loss and health improvements they experienced led Dr. Harper to counsel thousands of people on the BioDiet with similarly consistent and impressive results. Dr. Harper is an associate professor of kinesiology at the University of the Fraser Valley and a visiting scientist at the British Columbia Cancer Research Center at the Terry Fox Laboratory. He holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in comparative physiology at the University of Cambridge. He is on the scientific advisory board of the Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition and is a member of the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition. He is the author of the best-selling book, BioDiet, the scientifically proven ketogenic way to lose weight and improve health. I consider Dr. Harper to be a great friend and a great human being. Dr. David Harper, what an honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Wow, what a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for the introduction, my good friend Casey. And it's been a while. We've been trying to do this for a little while. For the listeners there, Casey and I actually have run into each other personally a couple of times at various low carb and keto conferences, and saw each other most recently back live again, which is kind of nice in your hometown of Salt Lake City. Right. And I'd never been there before. It's a beautiful town. I really enjoyed myself. So a big shout out to all the really nice folks in Salt Lake City there where you live.
It is a really lovely place. We didn't exactly save the best weather for you that weekend. It was April, which is highly variable around here. And I know you're used to kind of cold and wet weather yourself, but we can, get some really warm, sunny spring days. And that just didn't really happen at the time that you were here.
It was sunny. It was plenty good. The hills had snow on them. And I look forward to coming back soon.
That's great. Well, we are more than welcome, more than ready to welcome you back at any time. Sure. The first time that we met was basically the weirdest weekend of probably both of our lives. Low Carb Denver 2020 in March. That was a little strange. I think we started the weekend by hugging and shaking hands. And by the end of it, everybody was elbow bumping and half the people have left at that point. It was a really strange weekend.
It was. I arrived, I guess the conference started on the Friday. I arrived on the Thursday for, the cocktail party and that sort of thing. And things were just closing down. And Friday was Friday the 13th. And I was staying at the Hyatt there in Denver, and there was supposed to be an international volleyball tournament that shut down. So I had the whole hotel to myself, which was good fun. And then at the conference, I wasn't even slated to be a speaker at that one, but I think it was actually Gary Taubes that a good friend of ours. I know he's been on your show too. I don't think Gary felt it was safe to go. And I was there and I just said, listen, we got this cancer research project working on. I have a deck. So they just sort of threw me in there as the keynote first thing Saturday morning. And, fortunately I've done that talk before. And apparently very well received. We've had 200,000 downloads on YouTube for that one. If people want to see it, they can look at usually it's Dr. David G. Harper. That's kind of my professional name. And just keto, and that'll pop up a whole bunch of different talks I've done, mostly on the cancer research area.
Wow.
With keto too. Yeah. So that was a fun first meeting, and it was actually a really good conference in the end. There was a lot of great speakers there, and I see that's going to happen again next year. I see already Dr. Gerber and Dr. Taylor have organized Low Carb Denver. I think it's going to be up in the mountains next year, but That looks like fun.
Yeah, that'll be great. It's so funny. I had no idea that you weren't one of the original presenters. You did a fantastic job. And I took a few screenshots of things that I was seeing in that conference. And I took two of yours. One was talking about low carbohydrate diets and infectious disease, which all of a sudden was very relevant. And the second one was the cancer model, where you showed the cancer just magically disappearing. I've never seen anything like that. And to be able to record that video, I still have it saved on my phone. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's impressive. That's why you put them in slide decks, right? But there is a bit of a caveat, which if you do view that for your listeners and your viewers, I'm talking a bit fast, and the reason was it's really an hour talk that I tried to compress down, and then I thought it would be remiss of me not to mention the evidence that supports a ketogenic diet benefiting reduced infection from COVID and also better outcomes. And for those of people that are interested, it's actually, I think, a more interesting talk than the one I did on cancer. I did that at Keto Salt Lake, but it was online. It's kind of viewed like this. And I did that last year, so 2021. So if you look up keto and COVID, it'll probably pop up. It is pretty sciencey because I talk about how, from a cellular biological perspective, molecular biology and cellular biology, how a ketogenic diet might benefit in terms of preventing you from being infected, preventing the COVID virus from infecting your lungs, and then both the innate immune response, which is what we study in terms of the cancer therapy, and then the adaptive response, which is the antibody response. And there's definitely potential for benefits all the way along there. And I think, given the news we're hearing lately that there's probably a fourth wave coming, and it may be another Omicron or something different, and it may be happening now or maybe in the fall, but you have time to get yourself keto adapted if you're not. And if you are keto adapted, I can't say for sure, because obviously we haven't done the science yet, but I think if you view that video from Keto Salt Lake in 2021, people have a very good understanding of how a ketogenic diet might benefit you in that light. So I think it's important that we get that news out to people too.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And anecdotally, I think everybody at that conference in March at least was talking about the fact that most of them had not been sick in a very long time. If they'd been following a ketogenic diet, it's like, wow, yeah, when was the last time I got a cold or a flu? Like I always got them every year, and then I never did, and these people never did, and all those people never did. And it's following that lifestyle. Definitely anecdotally, you could say that I think a lot of people in this world know that.
Well, yeah, and that's what we're trying to learn more about is at the cellular molecular level in terms of the communication between our immune system cells, how it does provide that protection. Like most of the research that's going on in keto science now, and there's a lot, by the way. So this is not a fad. It's not, there have been, because when you put diet in it, people start thinking about fad diets and calorie restricted short-term. That's not what it is. It's a lifestyle change. It has fundamental, profound, beneficial changes to your overall metabolism. But what we're also trying to learn is the fundamental positive changes to your immune system. And as you say, every time I go to a conference, I say, how many people have noticed since they've been keto adapted, they've had fewer colds and flus. Like almost everybody puts up their hands. And so, yeah, sure, that's anecdotal. That's not science, but it's what we hear time and time again. I haven't, sample size of one. I haven't had so much as a sniffle since the first Obama administration, so that goes back a while. And I think that's pretty typical. Now, I'm also in good health otherwise, and but I think right now most of the research is on chronic disease. So just again for your listeners, acute diseases are things like, well, obviously injuries and trauma, but infectious diseases, particularly, viruses, bacteria, fungus, and that sort of thing. Those are acute diseases, and that hasn't been looked at very much. I'd love to do more work on that. We're looking at the potential for therapeutic benefit for chronic disease, and those are diseases that develop slowly over time and cause more persistent disease states like cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and other neurological conditions. And it turns out that for all of those, we're seeing really significant benefits. In fact, Dr. Eric Westman, who is also speaking with us in Salt Lake, just had a paper come out this week about the potential benefits for people with really refractive psychiatric conditions. And I posted that, my Facebook and LinkedIn. I think on LinkedIn, if you look me up, I'm Dr. David T. Harper. On Facebook, I'm Dave Harper, but I post all the stuff that we're doing and the research that comes out. And I usually start that off with, what the science says, ... because I'm, you can view me as kind of a filter for the crap that's out there, because there's lots of misinformation and, in fact, deliberate disinformation about diets. There's a lot of vested interests that don't want to see people adopt ketogenic diets because they're basically devoid of processed foods. And the processed food industry is a $3 trillion a year industry, and they're not very keen on us telling people not to eat processed foods. So I think it's important that we have shows like your show that allow people like me to present the science to people so that they have that fundamental understanding of the benefits of a ketogenic diet. And I should say, as we're talking about that, it's not for everyone. There are some contraindications, and those are listed in my book. I have the book here, BioDiet, in the first part of the second half. You should talk about this with your physician. It is a significant metabolic change, so you should talk about it with your physician. There may be a need for a concomitant reduction of prescription medications, particularly antihypertensive or high blood pressure drugs, because the diet has a blood pressure lowering effect. You may have, if you're diabetic and you're taking metformin or insulin, you'll probably need to reduce the amount of insulin or metformin you're taking. And all of this is very consistent, even with the very ill women that we're working with in our cancer research studies. They see the same metabolic benefits as healthy people do in that same short period of time, within a few months. And so it isn't for everyone. Talk to your doctor. Don't get your information off of YouTube. Because people will say, oh, I tried a ketogenic diet, it didn't work. And first of all, I don't know what they're eating. So I don't know if they're ketogenic or not. I don't know what they're measuring. I don't know where they started. But usually what they do is they just start eating, potatoes, bread, rice. They stop eating carbs, but they don't know how to actually supplement their diet with healthy fats and other foods so that they get a balanced diet. And then they run into all kinds of problems with keto flu and cravings and that sort of thing. So that's part of the reason I bought the book. Actually, read the book. I should say wrote the book. I wrote it, Casey, in the back of my mind with your family physician in mind. So, so they really don't get a lot of nutrition education, in their defense. Your family physician is very interested in your health and improving your health, but they don't get nutrition education. So they're not nutrition experts. So when you come to them and ask them about, what about a ketogenic diet? I'm overweight, I'm diabetic, I have some, signs of hypertension or whatever. They're probably going to kind of maybe roll their eyes. They might have heard of it. But, tell them about my book, maybe, because that will explain to them how it works and why it works. And in Canada, and there's an equal movement in the States, but there's a group of us called the Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition. I think you mentioned in the introduction. There are now about 7,000 or 8,000 physicians, mostly physicians in Canada, that are trying to advocate for a nutrition-first, drug-free approach to chronic disease before we start dealing with drugs and surgeries and so on. I mean, I've often said we don't really, in Canada and the United States, even though we have difference in our healthcare systems, both of them aren't really healthcare systems, they're disease management systems.
Right.
We wait till it breaks down, and then we manage the disease as it progresses to an inexorable shorter lifespan and a unhealthier, unhappier life. So what we need is more preventative medicine. And I can't honestly say from a scientific perspective that a ketogenic diet will prevent cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. I can't say that because we haven't done that experiment, and we never will, because you'd have to get tens of thousands of people, you'd have to lock them away and feed them 2 separate diets and then see the rate at which these diseases develop. And our study, for example, it's almost $1 million for 20 women in the experimental side for a six month, actually it's a 3-month intervention. So, there's just not enough money on the planet to do that experiment. And that's some of the critics of ketogenic diets say, well, we haven't done that experiment because they know we never will. So what we do is we look at its value as a therapeutic intervention for people that have those diseases. So what we see regularly, when we talk about metabolic conditions, and there's, a condition called metabolic disease, which is typically, obesity, so waistline, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, your lipids get out of whack, and high blood sugar. And we see those correct themselves for 7 out of 8 people in a very consistent pattern, time and time again. So it really is a good place to start for most people. But again, check with your physician first and make sure there aren't any contraindications dependent on your present state of health too.
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. I'm so glad you were able to explain that. I was introduced to your work through one of my clients who technically, I guess, is still type 2 diabetic, but he was taking an enormous amount of insulin. He's lost tons of fat. He takes basically no insulin and has done so for several years. And the thing that I really appreciated about your book, it was something that could explain everything in detail, but also was simple enough for him to understand it. And I've given out your book several times to people because I know they'll take something out of it. It's not just the science, and you do such a great job. You remind me a lot of like Ben Bickman, who you're a researcher, you fellow Canadian, you know how to get into the weeds on all this stuff, but you also know how to communicate that in a way that people can understand it and really appreciate it. And I've loved that about your approach and the way you explain things. I love that about your book, BioDiet. Maybe we should go back and talk about like how you got interested in health to begin with and how that led to you, creating the BioDiet.
Yeah, sure. And thank you. That's very complimentary. I think, if anything, I'm a communicator. At my stage of my career, I don't do the bench science. We have lots of really, really smart young people. I should mention I work with my colleague, Jeff Volek. I'm part of his team at the Ohio State University, even though I'm based here in Vancouver in Canada. And I work with Dr. Jerry Crystal at the BC Cancer Research Center. But our study on breast cancer is with Jeff Volek's team. So we get the young people to do all that. Really, they're way smarter than I am and know how to do all that really cool molecular and cellular biology. I kind of view myself more as a communicator. And I'm one of those people, when I learn something and I see its value, I want to tell everybody. And so it was funny though, the way it all started, if you want to know the beginning of the story, I actually had a radio show about critical reasoning, critical thinking. It was called Think for Yourself. Co-hosted with a friend of mine, and it was on sort of local community access radio, like I'm sure you have in Salt Lake. And we had a guest on who had been studying indigenous traditional diets, which are basically ketogenic. I mean, there wasn't a lot of pizza and bread up there in the north, and the Inuit and so on, with Inuit peoples. So we were on and we were sort of talking about what's the cause and best treatment for weight management, right? What's the cause of obesity? What's the best way to manage your weight? And I was going to take the sort of exercise side, being a kinesiology professor. And I should mention my background is more in physiology. I'm not a professional kinesiologist. I teach anatomy, physiology, pathology, and nutrition. And he was going to talk about the diet side of it. And this was 14, 15 years ago, maybe something like that, or a dozen years ago anyway. And we were just talking about, and I gave the usual, he said, well, what do you think causes obesity? And I said, well, it's very complicated. His name is Dr. Richard Mathias. I said, it's very complicated, Dr. Mathias. It's a multifactorial condition that has psychosocial factors and metabolic factors and genetic factors. And he just sort of quietly listened to me. He said, no, it's not. It's your body's natural response to excess carbohydrate in the diet. And we were on radio, kind of like we are now. And I just did this. Like we call it dead air, right? Because in my brain, my little brain was going, oh my God, because you got to remember, I've been studying physiology for like 25 years at that time. And I thought, oh my God, could it possibly be that simple? And why didn't I ever think of that? And it turns out it pretty much is, which brings us to the philosophical principle of Occam's razor, which is when you're trying to investigate the reason for something, first look for the simplest explanation. And don't look for a more complicated one until you've discarded the simpler one. And here I was pitching the more complicated reason. And he was telling me, no, it's much simpler. And I couldn't think of a reason why that wasn't correct. And I thought, oh my God, carbohydrate, insulin, right, promotes obesity, and giving people that are diabetic, a high carb diet just makes it worse. And what if we just took that out? So I kind of, getting back to the book, I kind of developed this model for all chronic disease, which has three factors. I call it the axis of illness, which is kind of a play on, George Bush one's axis of evil.
I love it.
Yeah. And anyway, so the three things, and any physician or healthcare worker will tell you that, the three factors, if we could address these three factors, we could prevent a lot of chronic disease and treat a lot of chronic disease. And that's obesity is one. We know that obesity is related to all kinds of it. It's one of the, after smoking, the leading lifestyle factor that associates with poor cancer outcomes, obviously diabetes, obviously heart disease, these are all, and even Alzheimer's. So one is obesity. Another one is insulin resistance itself, which is the body's inability to metabolize insulin properly when it's been subjected to excessive insulin for a prolonged period of time, which is what happens on a high carb diet, because the carbs turn into sugar and the sugar needs to be taken out of your blood because it'll cause problems if it's left there. So you need the insulin to get it out. So I think people understand that role of insulin. There's other roles. And the third part is inflammation. And I think people are realizing that cardiovascular disease doesn't have anything to do with cholesterol in your diet or how many eggs you ate last week or what how much saturated fat you have. It's due to inflammation. And so those three things, inflammation, insulin resistance, and obesity, are the three sort of cornerstones of what I call the axis of illness. And the thing is, they all make each other worse. So it doesn't even really matter which starts to manifest first. They'll make each other worse. And I think it just kind of goes around and around, kind of a vicious circle, until it spins off as one or more of these chronic diseases. So diabetes is kind of arbitrarily defined as a blood sugar level above this, if from a fasting glucose test or a home IR or whatever, obviously involving insulin resistance as well as high blood sugar. So I think that those three factors contribute, are the root cause of chronic disease, and that a high carbohydrate diet in a chronic manner, which we've been eating for 30 or 40 years, makes all of those things worse. And you'll notice that people who are obese tend to have more cardiovascular disease and more diabetes. And that's I don't even think they're different diseases, Casey. I think it's just different manifestations of the same problem, which is at the mitochondrial level, which are the little energy converters in our cells. They're almost like little alien beings there in our cells. If those are healthy, we're healthy. If those are unhealthy, we're unhealthy. And I think if you look at the mitochondria people with chronic disease, they're all unhealthy. The mitochondria are, and those diseases will often get so-called comorbidities. You get one, you get another, you get another. The healthcare, quote in quotes, healthcare system will try and manage that. So your blood pressure is too high. Well, let's not address the root cause, which might be inflammation. Let's just give you an anti-blood pressure drug, right? We'll bring something that brings blood. Well, it's good for now, but it doesn't, unless you address the root cause, you're not really going to have a long-term benefit. So that's why we're now talking about reversal of diabetes, reversal of heart disease. Obviously, you can see reversal of obesity, like your client that you were talking about. You lost how many pounds?
Oh, in total, he's lost about 100. He started his journey 4 or 5 years ago at 300 pounds. He's just over 200 pounds now. But when we really started to focus on knocking carbohydrates out of the diet, he lost another 30 pretty quick and doesn't use the same medications that he was before.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing. 90+% of people, this is from the Virta work, that are type 2 diabetic that adopt a well-formulated ketogenic diet. We can talk about what that means in a moment. 90% of people reduce their need of type 2 diabetics will reduce their need for medication. About 2/3 of people are just reversed completely. As long as they stay ketogenic, they don't need medication. And some of these people have been on medication for decades. And sometimes 4 weeks later, they don't need to take any medication. Their body's been returned to its natural state and no longer a disease state. And the good news about all this, those three factors, if you reduce any of them, they all start getting better too. Yeah. So if you can reduce that excess body fat, which we call obesity, and I don't like using BMI, as you probably know, but if you reduce your body fat, that's a good thing. If you can reduce your insulin resistance, the way you do that is by moderating your insulin levels, and you do that by reducing your carbohydrate consumption. If you can reduce your inflammation, you can do that by stop eating sugar, for darn sake. Sugar is poison. Don't eat that stuff. And get off of seed oils. Don't those vegetable seed oils, those things are highly inflammatory. They're full of omega-6 fatty acids. So if we just did that, notice I'm not saying like eat less, exercise more. And I'm a kinesiologist. Exercise is super beneficial for all kinds of reasons. But the most important lifestyle factor in terms of chronic disease is at the end of your fork. You have to consider what you're putting in your mouth every day. And if you put really good tasting, high fat, high nutrient value foods in your mouth, like, I don't know, fish, beef, eggs. That's why there's a reason there's an egg on the cover of my book, little self-promotion there. And that is, if you think about an egg, you open an egg and you see what's in it. There's the yolk, and there's the white, and the white is just protein, and the yolk is just fat and protein. And so somehow from that, you get a chicken with the same, more or less the same 200 tissue types that we have, a few weeks later. So everything in, and there's no carbs in there, right? A tiny bit, but there's no carbs in there. You don't need carbs. There's no essential carbohydrates. There are some beneficial, and there's some argument about, fiber, soluble and insoluble. I'm okay with fiber, but you don't need to eat any carbohydrates. So why our policymakers are recommending this high carb diet as being healthy, I have no idea. There is no evidence to support that. And in fact, the overall sort of anecdotal evidence, the last 30 or 40 years that we have been eating this high carb diet, we've seen an explosion of obesity, we've seen an explosion of diabetes, and heart disease and cancer are increasing, not decreasing, despite all the new interventions we have, and despite the fact that people quit smoking. So really, again, the most important decision you make every day is what nutrition you're going to get during that day, and if you adopt a well-formulated ketogenic diet for 7 out of 8 people, I think it will, and it's back of the envelope, no meticulous statistics behind this, but I think you can reduce your risk of chronic disease by about 70%, 70. Yeah, for most people. And if you have a chronic disease, and obesity is recognized as a disease in the United States, so that the insurers can actually provide assistance there, financial assistance. But if you can treat obesity and reduce insulin resistance and reduce inflammation, there's no drugs that do all of those things. And right. Even singly, there's no drugs that will do it as well as a ketogenic diet. So why wouldn't you start with the simplest solution that's also the safest solution, with the caveat of those contraindications? Why not start there first and see how that goes before you start giving people drugs that have side effects that then need more drugs to, correct the side effects and so on. I just think our healthcare system has it backwards. It's kind of like, rather than putting good gas in your car, let's just put like a bunch of, remember the old joke about putting sugar in somebody's gas tank? Let's put a bunch of sugar and crappy gas and, kerosene and stuff in the car and see what happens. Well, it breaks down. Okay, let's fix that. But if you keep putting junk in the car, it's not going to help.
That's right.
You need to fix the root cause.
Yeah, dude, that is so well explained. I love that. Is it fair to take from what you said that you are going on record to say that the egg did come before the chicken? You just solved the ages-long debate.
It did. And this is, you're talking to a biologist now, because of course, birds and mammals came after reptiles, and reptiles have eggs. So in fact, humans have eggs, they just don't have shells. So yes, the egg came before the chicken.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. That's awesome. And it's good news also that you said earlier that eggs don't cause, the heart disease that a lot of people talk about, because I think you and I both consume massive amounts of eggs and hopefully won't just keel over and die during this podcast interview with a heart attack. You've done such a great job explaining the axis of illness, which I absolutely love. It is so important to understand that, yes, it will circle and cycle down negatively, but it can also cycle up positively. So I wonder, and quickly. Yeah, that's
so
the crazy thing.
You don't have to wait for 10 years. You can find out in about 4 weeks if it's working for you or not.
Yeah, that's right. I wonder if we could go into a little bit more, like explaining why it is that consuming so many carbohydrates is really so bad for us. When we hear things like the brain needs carbohydrates, or it's a quick, accessible fuel source, it's good for, my kids at their soccer game or whatever. Maybe we can talk about that, and maybe we can contrast that with why is a ketogenic diet so good for us?
Yeah, so there's a lot in the question that you asked, but it's a great question. So there are a lot of myths out there, and they're just myths that, like many memes, they just continue because we don't really discuss them. But the notion that the brain, for example, needs 150 grams of carbohydrate every day, that's because the brain cannot metabolize fats and cannot metabolize proteins. So it has to metabolize carbohydrates. There's an extra little layer of protection called the blood-brain barrier, and you need special transporters to get things through there. Well, we've known since Cahill studies in the 1960s that the brain can actually use another fuel other than glucose. The notion was that, and even when I learned physiology, first year, it was like, oh yeah, the brain can only use glucose. So you have to make sure you get enough glucose in your diet. By the way, if I asked you just offhand, how much in terms of a volume, how much sugar, how much glucose is circulating in your blood right now?
Yeah, I know the answer to that, but I think that the real answer would shock a lot of people.
Yeah.
The answer would be about a teaspoon.
About a teaspoon, right? So
Crazy.
yeah, and of course it's replaced as it gets used up. It's not very much, so it's not like your blood is really sugary. Otherwise, it would taste sweet. So it turns out that your brain not only can use ketones. Now, when you produce ketones, you produce it through fat metabolism. So there's an easy explanation of how ketogenic diets help you lose fat is you're not burning carbohydrates because you are producing your own through something called gluconeogenesis, but the selected fuel, then you shift to burning fat for most of your non-basal metabolic purposes. And when you metabolize that fat, you produce ketones. The only ketone is acetone, but it's all initially produced as acetoacetate, which is called a ketone body. Some of it gets converted to acetone, which is basically nail polish remover, and usually just breathe that out, which is how those sort of breath monitors for keto. I think there's Ketonics is a company that does that. And then the rest of it gets converted into something called beta hydroxybutyrate, or BHB. That's a really beneficial fuel. It's almost like a super fuel, and I don't use that term lightly. It's a super fuel in the sense that your body prefers to use that. So your brain, if there is an available supply of beta hydroxybutyrate, if you're keto adapted, which by the way is the normal human state, going back in our evolutionary path,
yes,
your brain will selectively use that. Now there is a transporter that it needs to get into the nerve cells, the neurons. It's called an Mct transporter. It's not MCT oil, it's different MCT. But it goes down its concentration gradient. It doesn't have to be pumped in like glucose does. So it's actually easier for the ketone, the beta hydroxybutyrate, to get into the nerve cells and be burned there than it is for the glucose. And when it's burned or metabolized, it produces less inflammation, less inflammatory response. And of course, if you look at something like Alzheimer's, it's an inflammatory condition, as is MS and other things. So there's no surprise that that a ketogenic diet would have benefits for people with neurological problems. So one of the first uses in a clinical sense was over 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago, for epilepsy. And for some forms of refractory epilepsy, it's very, very beneficial. Check out the Charlie Foundation, for example, and their work promoting the use of ketogenic diets at over 200 hospitals throughout the world. I think that number is even a bit higher now.
Wow, amazing.
We've seen evidence that it's beneficial for Parkinson's disease. We've seen evidence that it's beneficial for mood disorders like bipolar disease. We've seen benefits for autism. And all of these are being studied, all these neurological conditions. So there's the brain now being provided with its preferred beneficial fuel that's less inflammatory. It's kind of like shifting from a gas-powered car in your brain to an electric car. Suddenly you're not polluting that environment up there. And the other cool thing, Casey, is in our studies, when we image the women to view their tumors, the heart is the most metabolically diverse organ, that it'll burn anything. Anything. It's kind of like a diesel engine, because it just has to keep going no matter what. So you can throw sawdust in a diesel engine, it'll keep running. The heart will do that too, because it has to keep running. But when we see the women initially in our studies, and the imaging agent is a glucose, it's a radioactive glucose called fluorodeoxyglucose. So it has a little radioactive fluorine in there that allows us to image the glucose movement. And so we see it concentrated in the heart, because the heart will use that glucose if it's available. But when these women are keto adapted, the heart disappears from the imaging. So what's that telling you? Well, it's, the inference is kind of obvious, is the heart is preferring to use a ketone because it's less inflammatory. And what's cardiovascular disease? An inflammatory disease. So the heart's smart. It knows that this is a better fuel. I should be going electric instead of, burning fuel. And the brain does the same thing. The two most important organs, as far as keeping us alive and active, both prefer ketones. So that notion of 150 grams a day is just, it's nonsense. The brain needs as much fuel as it can, but it can get up to 80% of that from ketones, but that's only under severe starvation purposes. So where does it get the rest of the glucose if you're not in a starvation state? And that's through a natural process that all carnivores have, omnivores too, called gluconeogenesis, which literally means making new glucose. And that means you're making glucose for the blood, that teaspoon of glucose you need, that level of a teaspoon in 5 liters. Think of it, 5 liters of blood, and there's a teaspoon of sugar in there. It can produce that regularly by taking the glycerol from fatty acids, and mostly amino acids and other metabolites, and turning those into glucose as needed, ad libitum, as we say in medicine. And so you don't need to. That's why you don't need to consume any carbohydrates, because you really only need them for the glucose, and the glucose can be produced naturally, which is what your cat and your dog does, and most other carnivores. Totally natural process. Fiber, probably a story for another day, but it's there are beneficial fibers, but they're not metabolized into glucose. They're not broken down into glucose in the blood, so they shouldn't affect your blood sugar. In fact, some soluble fibers actually reduce your, the rate at which sugar crosses the digestive system. So you don't need it. There are no essential carbohydrates, right? And so the only reason we eat them, now you did mention a couple of performance states, and I can talk a little bit about that. That's more like Jeff Bullock's area, and Parker Hyde, who's now at University of North Georgia. He's another guy to look at. He works with the U.S. military there. By the way, there's a lot of keto people working with the military. Because they're high performance, high risk jobs, right? So we want war fighters to have the maximum mental alertness, the ability to resist hunger, the ability to perform without injury. If you're divers, Dom D'Agostino in University of South Florida is studying Navy SEALs. And if you're burning ketones instead of glucose, your brain can tolerate much lower oxygen levels, so you can stand underwater longer. All kinds of super cool stuff. And obviously, we focus on that particular subject group because it's a very high risk, especially those specialists like Navy SEALs, Rangers, fighter pilots, that sort of thing, and greater mental acuity. I don't know. That's pretty important when you're doing those sorts of operations, right? Ability to withstand periods without sleep. All those sorts of things are all benefiting. You have to be careful. Like, there's so many myths out there. I mean, there's been a couple of great sort of blogs written about all the myths about diets and ketogenic diets. And one of the main ones is that there are essential carbohydrates because your brain needs 150 grams of glucose every day. So you have to eat it. That's a myth. The other one is that ketogenic diets are dangerous. They're not. Every physician learns about a state called ketoacidosis, which is often a complication of severe diabetes, where it's an artifact of the metabolism that occurs when your body can't metabolize sugar at all in diabetes, and because it can't get it into the cells to metabolize, so you start metabolizing fats like crazy, and your ketone levels go so high that your blood becomes acidic, and that's life-threatening. That does not happen on a ketogenic diet, full stop. I don't know why people worry about that. Your body will naturally regulate that at a much lower level, like a half to a tenth of that sort of danger zone. And you can look at any blood-borne factor in your body, and if it gets too high, it's going to create problems. If it gets too low, it's going to create problems. So ketones are just another one of those. But within that range, which we call nutritional ketosis, and I think that was coined by Dr. Stephen Phinney, it's usually about 0.5 to 2 millimoles per microliter. That range of ketones, it almost trades off against the sugar. So if that's like 1 or 2, then the blood sugar can be like 3 or 4, which might be hypoglycemic to some people, but to those of us that are keto adapted, it's just fine because the brain and the heart are burning ketones instead of sugars.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's just so interesting when you put it in that context, how like you might pass, I don't know, some magazine at the supermarket that says keto and think, wow, check out this fad diet. This is going to come and go in a few years. The way you're explaining this, it makes so much sense from an evolutionary perspective that this is not a fad diet at all. This is our normal, natural state that we should be living in. And no wonder so many things optimize in so many different ways when you're eating this correct way. And you just just common sense. And like you mentioned, Occam's razor, you just think, what's the most simple thing that's changed? You mentioned vegetable oils, you mentioned refined carbohydrates. If I look outside right now, it's a beautiful summer day here in Salt Lake City, tons of plants everywhere, diverse, all kinds of different plants. There's not food. There's not just random food growing on all of these diverse plants. They don't just give you their food all the time. It's a very selective and special time of the year when you can find some fruit, maybe some vegetables. If it's not in a garden, I don't see any vegetables just growing randomly. We kind of have made them in a certain way. And so you look at that context, and then you go out and see all the soda shops and all the fast food joints and just the atrocities inside of a break room in somebody's office. And like, you have to make those connections.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is our culture is built around cheap, packaged, processed carbs, right? Because they taste good, we like it, triggers our body. I mean, we talked about performance in sport for a while there. There is some good evidence that you can train low and exercise high. In other words, you can train ketogenic, especially if you're an endurance athlete, or let's say like a soccer player. And then before the game, you can load up with carbohydrates, say 150 grams, because you're going to burn those before they have any problems for you. And so, super endurance athletes can consume carbohydrates in higher levels than you would expect for someone who's just wants to stay keto adapted with say a regular output. You have to be careful with that though. Because everybody thinks they're a world-class athletes. Those world-class
That's
athletes,
right.
they
That's
have
right.
phenomenal output, right? Same thing goes with bodybuilding or anything. You shouldn't be doing what they're doing because they're freaks, and they,
That's right.
not a lot of people can run 100-mile races through the desert mountains. Like, it's just so, don't necessarily do what they're doing. But if you are, let's say, a hockey player, a soccer player, or something like that. By the way, I hope our Whitecaps beat your, your Salt Lake.
Oh man. Low blow.
We beat them last time when they were here.
You did. I know, that was rough.
Yeah. But no, before those kinds of events, if you're going to be putting out a lot of effort or a hard bike ride or something, yeah, you can consume carbohydrates there, and it's not going to knock you out of ketosis or anything like that. But it's not the kind of thing you can do like an hour or two before, like that old idea of carbo loading, eating a bunch of, nobody does that anymore. That's crazy. That, what that'll do. That's how, I just remember his name now. But a lot of athletes that were like endurance athletes and marathon runners and so on. Tim Noakes, I was trying to think of. Tim Noakes, he was a marathon runner, and he was doing all the carbo loading and stuff. And basically what you end up doing is burning out your beta cells. They can't produce the insulin anymore. So he became terribly diabetic and almost died. And then he realized the sense of a ketogenic diet, and he turned his life around and saved his own life, and then wrote books and saved a lot of other people's lives too. So yeah, don't take it too far, but on a ketogenic diet, you do need to reduce that carbohydrate intake a lot. One of the questions people often ask me is, what about wine or beer, or and my answer is, well, fermentation is a good thing. It turns sugar into alcohol. Alcohol is metabolized differently. It can have some effects on insulin levels in your blood and so on, but in moderation and with the usual caveats of, assuming you're not driving or operating machinery, you can have I drink wine. Wine is fairly low in carbohydrates, so a glass or maybe two is fine. You don't have to refrain from alcohol. It's probably easier if you do. I eat a handful of berries a day, typically strawberries, blackberries, blueberries. Some people like Dr. Westman don't eat any fruit at all, but he's also dealing with people that are sort of hyper obese, and they're really trying to get their carbs down below like 20 grams a day or even lower than that. That's really tough. But once you're keto adapted, you can get into, you have to decide what your range is. So my range is probably depending on my activity level, because I'm still pretty active. So, yesterday I swam 2.5K, that's like running a 10K run kind of thing.
Not bad.
So if I'm doing that, I might have that third glass of wine or something, but generally, my range I know is probably between about 50 and 100 grams a day, but I'm also, quite lean and physically active. So the less active you are, probably the lower you want to keep your carbs. But once you're keto adapted, you can kind of raise your consumption. And I'm not talking about going and eating bread. I'm talking about maybe more nuts than you were eating before, maybe a little bit different kind of cheese or something like that. But the foods you eat on a ketogenic diet, somewhere out there, it was in Business Insider magazine, they had this picture of, it was an article I did for Business Insider on ketogenic diets a couple of years ago. So they wanted a picture of like the food you'd eat. And I said, well, I just came home from getting groceries. So I put it all on the table. Unfortunately, there's no fish on it. So I eat a lot of fish, but I just laid it out on the table there. Maybe I can send you the picture if I can find it, Casey, and you can post it on your site.
Great.
And I just look at that, and it's, it's got cream and eggs, but it's tons of vegetables. There's nuts in there. But you look at that and you go, how could anybody look at that and say that's an unhealthy diet? Because it's all just real food. But the trick that people are challenged with, especially women and in particular young women, is eating more saturated fat.
Yes.
Now you can eat monounsaturated fat, olive oil. So if you have a 2,000 calorie a day diet and you wanted to get all of your calories from just all of your fat calories, so let's say 60% would be a minimum for a ketogenic diet, and you want to get that all from olive oil, it would be about 2/3 of a cup of olive oil. So I'm not saying you should do that, but it won't hurt you. But so it's not that much because it's so energy dense, right? Whereas if you look at, people ask me, can you be vegan and be ketogenic? Absolutely, you can. You're probably going to be eating a lot of soy and things like that. So, if you're a woman trying to get pregnant, there may be some estrogen disruption issues there, but you absolutely can. But you have to eat like so much food in order to get all of those nutrients. And that's what brings me around to the notion of the well-formulated ketogenic diet. Again, kudos to my mentor of sorts in this field, Dr. Stephen Phinney, who was really one of the first people that did some of the seminal research back in the 1980s. Like, we knew about this stuff decades ago, and this is how long it takes to get into the public realm. This is why it's not a fad. The science is there. There are thousands of projects going on globally by the best researchers all over the world about the therapeutic benefits of ketogenic diets. So he coined the term well-formulated ketogenic diet, and I use that in my post. What that means is that it provides full nutrition. So you're not lacking any nutrients and so on. And it's actually, despite the criticisms you hear about ketogenic diets not being balanced or not providing complete nutrition because you're not eating vegetables, I think they're just either misleading us or misinformed, because something like beef, for example, and let's put the environmental costs aside, is just loaded with vitamins and minerals and stuff like that. You'd have to eat so many vegetables in order to get the same nutrients you get from, say, 4 ounces of beef. But you don't have to eat beef. Like, there's this whole environmental debate. I mean, things like eggs and chicken and dairy and much, much, much lower environmental impact. And in fact, you can take that impact down to zero with restorative farming practices. And we've heard some of that at the conferences we go to as well. So that the notion that somehow being ketogenic, and I know there is, I wouldn't call it a fad. I think it's sort of a natural progression to carnivore diets, people that eat only meat. You probably want to supplement with a few things, but all by all accounts, and I think it was David Diamond, did a study recently, no adverse effects. Like, people saying, oh, you can't possibly just eat meat, you'd be missing all those nutrients. No, the nutrients are in the meat, and they're way more dense than they are in most of the vegetables you're eating, and you have to eat a lot less of it. So the reason I mentioned that volume of 2/3 of a cup is because fats are so energy dense, there's no water in them, you don't need a lot of it. So, a little grass-fed butter on your vegetables, adds a lot of really beneficial omega-3 fatty acids to your diet. And you don't need to eat a lot of food. So my wife and I actually don't eat physically a lot of food, because the food we eat is very nutrient dense, and it's part of a well-formulated ketogenic diet. So I know it provides full nutrition, all the nutrients and minerals and everything you need.
Yeah, such a great point. I love that. I think if you haven't eaten this way, you won't appreciate what those foods will do to you as far as satiety. Most people know what fullness feels like, but I don't think a lot of people understand what satiety is. When you eat something that's so rich and nourishing, you just can't take another bite if you wanted to. And then you go like a weird amount of hours without even thinking about food. If you've been on the up and down kind of roller coaster of eating a high carbohydrate diet, you have no idea what you're missing as far as that goes. It is amazing to experience that kind of food freedom.
Yeah, I had a fellow came up to me. He'd, been on the BioDiet, read the book, and he's an emergency room physician. And he wanted to thank me for writing the book. He'd lost weight, improved all kinds of things. But he said the main thing for me on the job is I don't get hungry. So I can do a full 12-hour shift without feeling hungry. And part of the reason for that, there's hormones that regulate hunger and satiety. So hunger is the feeling you need to eat. Satiety is the feeling of being full. And they're called leptin and ghrelin. And ghrelin is really released to make you feel hungry. Ghrelin G for go. But leptin works in the brain, in the hypothalamic region of the brain, and it has other complex issues. And people that suffer from obesity often have disruptive leptin metabolism. So the stop button is dysfunctional in them. So once they start eating, they can't stop themselves. And obviously that can lead to overconsumption and obesity. And so one of the things that we know that ketogenic diets do is bring those hormones, leptin and ghrelin, back to their normal levels. So you don't need to eat. Like when when you do eat, you don't tend to overeat. You don't eat that much. And so this is tea, but I use full fat cream, like whipping cream in my tea. I usually have like a coffee with full fat cream in it at midday. I do eat breakfast. Some people don't. I do kind of narrow that eating window down to about 8 hours a day. And then, I have a full meal at dinner, but I'm pretty knowledgeable about nutrition. So I know what to eat to make sure I get full nutrition. But anybody that looked at what we eat would just say, wow, that looks amazingly healthy. And I go, yeah, but it's also about 70% fat. And probably most of that is saturated fat. They go, oh my God, you must be dead of a heart attack. I go, no, actually I'm in perfect health. It's even my physician, who's kind of rolls his eyes once in a while, but he just says, I don't know, like whatever you're doing. He said, you're boring. There's nothing wrong with you. You should, according to what we were taught, you should be dead by now. You should have terrible atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease. And he said, you got none of that. Your blood pressure is fine. Same with my wife. Her coronary calcium score is fine. She had an angiogram. She had to have a valve replacement, completely clean. HDL off the charts, just totally triglycerides and ketogenically adapted people very low. That's the fat circulating in your blood because you're burning those. And yet she has this diet that's fantastically high in saturated fat, and they just can't figure it out. And they go, well, that's because you learned the wrong stuff when you were educated.
Totally. That's the one good thing you mentioned earlier, that doctors don't get a lot of nutrition education. It's almost like it's better that they don't, because if they did, they'd be getting more of the wrong information anyway. It might exacerbate the problem to begin with. It isn't
actually
good.
You know what? I've never heard that put to me. That is an excellent point, because I always lament the fact the average in North American medical schools is 5 to 7 hours of nutrition education during med school. Many schools have no nutrition in the curriculum at all. But it's a good point. It's probably good that they don't get more, because otherwise they would get more of the wrong information. We do need to re-educate, a whole population of dietitian, nutrition scientists. It's starting to happen. We're starting to see changes amongst cardiologists. There's still a lot of pushback. From lab bench discovery to clinical practice in medicine, you typically take 17 years.
Wow.
And so, we started realizing the therapeutic benefits in a meaningful way through rigorous, randomized controlled trials and so on in about the early mid 2000s. So we're getting to that point now where it's starting to work its way into common practice, thus the Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition, thus, Virta's success in helping people manage the type 2 diabetes, which no drug can do, by the way, to the degree that they can do it. And there, by the way, that Virta and Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney are principals there, and it's a for-profit company, but they're trying to help 100 million people get off, type 2 diabetes, get off drugs. That's their goal. It's a very noble goal. And they don't get paid unless they're successful. So, and they don't get paid by the patients, they get paid by the insurers of the patients.
Amazing.
So it's a great deal for the patient. You just go on it, they give you all the stuff, they tell you what to do. It's all monitored online, so on. And if it doesn't work, Virta does not get paid. So that's a very, if it didn't work as well as it did, they would be out of business. But to their credit, it works fantastically well. So it's a great business model, as well as, if you do look at the cost in the United States, it is estimated that by 2030, the cost of treating just type 2 diabetes will be $660 billion with a B dollars. To put that in perspective, that is about the present defense budget.
That's crazy.
So that's just one disease. And the other comorbidities associated with that are also very expensive to treat, because we have all these really sexy, expensive interventions we do at the end of life. But if we can prevent all of that, think of the massive savings in a social sense. Think of the money we could put towards developing treatments for infectious disease, put into schools, put into re-educating people or educating people more, providing, better water and social services to people in urban areas that are socioeconomically challenged and so on. Think of the good we can do that. And what are we spending on it now? Insulin, right? And it's super expensive.
Crazy.
So it just doesn't seem to make sense to me when we have an answer and we know the answer works and we know that that is supported by very robust controlled clinical trials. So I throw my arms up in the air, which brings me to the point I mentioned before. What do you want to talk about? I want to talk about the fact that it's kind of futile to try and get our policymakers to change their mind. Both in Canada and the US, they are so fossilized in their bureaucracies. And the other problem is the nature of that business of being a bureaucrat in a government, or, in the United States, it's actually agriculture, Department of Agriculture that produces the food guide and so on, which tells you something there already. But you can't expect those people suddenly go, oh, yeah, okay, I get it now. We were wrong for 30 years. We told the public the wrong thing. The liability there would be massive. And I actually think that there will be a class action suit, like there was with cigarettes.
Smoking.
That states are going to start to look at companies that sell sugar to children, and they're going to start to say, you are liable for this massive increase in diabetes we're having. I could see that happening. And I think I am seeing a change in sugar. I think I think, if I'm correct, that the best-selling product for Coca-Cola right now is Coke Zero, which has no sugar in it.
Wow, interesting.
And I know there's new products all the time. My friend Steve Henley has a product called RX Sugar. I'm not promoting it. It's good. I like it. It's allulose, so it's not sucrose. It doesn't metabolize, so it doesn't have the negative health effects of that fructose in your system and raising your glucose levels. So there are good companies that are in the private sector that are coming along to provide solutions for us. And that also tells you that this whole ketogenic diet thing is not a fad. This is, people wouldn't be investing their time and money in developing products and services like Virta, like RX Sugar. They wouldn't be doing that if they didn't realize that there's a public need for that. And so that's what I encourage people to do is, don't write a letter to your congressman or congresswoman. It's going to go in the circular file. That kind of pressure won't help. I know Jeff Volek's been, up on the Hill talking to Congress, and they basically, cover their eyes and ears and don't want to hear what he's saying, even though he's probably one of the world's best researchers, full stop, and has the evidence to support it. So I think what we have to do, people like you and I, is get that message to the general public directly. So this, Boundless Body Radio, Boundless Body podcast you're doing, this is fantastic because it gives me the opportunity to get right to your clients who are the people out there. Tell them the science. Don't wait. Like, if you're waiting that 17 years for it to become common practice, depending on how old you are, do you have that long to wait if you're already diabetic and have heart disease? I don't think so, especially when I can pretty darn sure I can assure them that for most people out there, a ketogenic diet is going to solve a lot of those problems without using drugs. That's the message we need to get through to the public. And I think if we do, we're going to have a lot more healthier, happier people out there. And again, I'm very thankful that you give me the opportunity to do that. And I would say, people say, well, how can I get the word out there? And I say, well, from my perspective, you can buy my book, and it's pretty cheap. It's on audiobook and that sort of thing. People can go to biodiet.org. That's my website, and they can order it from there in any format. Give it to your friend. Spread the word about ketogenic diets. And this is from our clinical practice. It's not hospital food. It's really, really tasty, good food. It's not a recipe book or a menu book. It's a why to and a how to book. But if they can get that, and the best thing of all is if they buy a copy and give it to your physician and say, here, this is what I'm talking about. Have a look at this book. There's contraindications in there. Dr. Harper says, talk to your physician first. That's what I'm doing. Here's what I want to do. That's, if we could get to the physicians, the family practice physicians, who are generally pretty conservative because they follow their standard of care flow charts, if we can get to them, like we're doing in Canada, and ask them to consider ketogenic diets for their patients who are obese, insulin resistant, have diabetes and inflammation, and they then start to see that change. So a typical physician will have like 1,000 patients. So if they just see an improvement in one patient, they're going to try it in a second patient. And suddenly you've got someone who has 1,000 patients who understands the value. And then they tell their friends and so on. So really, if there was a target audience out there for me, it would be family practice physicians in the United States of America.
Yeah.
So if there's any listening out there, go to my website. You can send me an email through the website too. I answer those, not, I get a lot of them, so not necessarily right away, but I would love to hear from people and help support people. There's I've just been introduced to on LinkedIn, the former Lieutenant Governor of the state of, now this is in Australia, the Australian state of South Australia, who is keto adapted. The Prime Minister of Australia is a keto guy.
Wow.
Now, they asked him as a joke, what would a loaf of bread cost? And he goes, I don't know what a loaf of bread costs. I don't eat bread. I'm ketogenic. That's what, which is a great answer. So now things are changing. Like when you see the people at that end of it too, who have influence, they're realizing the benefits. And you probably noticed a couple of politicians that are carrying a few extra pounds. If they were to adopt this and bring that into policy change, that's where we have to change. So get to the people on the ground, the other humans, your friends, family, all that sort of thing. Get to your family practice positions, and then hopefully we can get to a couple of political leaders at some point and try and change public policy. And we can't do it fast enough.
Yeah, totally agree. When I get feeling really pessimistic about the situation systemically and feel like we're in the sick care system, people are getting way fatter, way sicker, way more diabetic. You walk anywhere to a mall or an airport, and you see it everywhere, and you just start to feel like so down. Like we're not moving this message forward. The people that find this get healed and they feel better, and they have a better quality of life. And what more could you ask for? We have such a short time to be here on this planet anyway. And so I get a little bummed out, but then talking to people like you and understanding that, yes, we can still push this message out. We can help people on the individual level. You mentioned politicians wanting to get feeling better. There's a lot of general practitioners, doctors who want to get feeling better. They're overrun. They're overstressed. They're not eating the right foods. And so to have that message of optimism that we really can make a change, it lights me up inside. And so I'm just so grateful for you and so grateful for your work. I love your book, BioDiet. I highly recommend that everybody grab it. It is affordable. It is very informative. If you don't do that, at least take David up, go to his website. Your website's amazing. All the resources and the printed guides and just all the appendices that you have in the book are there, and people can understand ingredients in food and where is sugar hiding in certain things. So you've done such a great job of getting that message out, and it really is an optimistic and positive message. And I really, really appreciate that. We covered about 1% of the things I wanted to talk about today.
So we got 99 more shows to do.
99 more shows to do. We would love to invite you back to come on sometime, and we could go in depth in something else. I really appreciate this conversation and all your work. For the listener, one more time, Dr. David Harper, can you tell people where to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Sure. So the website is BioDiet. I'll just hold the book up here for those that are watching. BioDiet, all one word, BioDiet.
It's a great cover. It's a great cover.
.org. Yeah, I designed that myself, actually. There we go. It's a long story about that cover and the colors I used and so on. But thanks. I didn't want it to look like a cookbook because it's not. So biodiet.org. If they want to follow my on LinkedIn, it's Dr. David G. Harper. On Facebook, I'm Dave Harper. I'm getting close to I think they only allow like 5,000 people on Facebook. I think I'm pretty close to the limit there, but you can find me on LinkedIn for sure. I post the same stuff to both of those typically. But the other thing I would suggest is that if you want, get your listeners to send questions for me to you, and then I can kind of answer those questions. We can go through them a little bit in advance, and I can answer those questions for them, because I'm sure there's people out there that have lots of questions. The other thing I'll just mention at the end is that I am not a physician. My PhD is in physiology. I'm not a physician, so I can't make medical recommendations. I couldn't do that anyway, even if I was, for individuals. I can provide health advice for people. But, I get a lot of, I have, or my wife has, or my husband has this kind of cancer. Can you help kind of thing? And the best help I can give them is first get the book and read the book. And then if you have some questions, let me know. Probably first talk to your physician, then read the book and then talk to your physician, one of those two. But I can't provide medical advice. So, and I do support the women in our studies. So I'm busy with that. But I'm generally happy to try and provide what advice I can for people. If they're quick questions, that helps. And I will get back to everybody who emails me through the website. And also if you have any comments or feedbacks on the book, the website I should mention, there's, like a lot of these, for a long time because of COVID, we didn't do anything. So it's kind of stalled at about 2020 for all the interviews and that sort of thing. They're coming up and it's my wife's job to catch up with that stuff. So that should be up there. But as you say, there's all kinds of the appendices and shopping lists and that sort of thing. They're available free. You don't have to give me your email or anything like that. They can just go to the site. And then at the bottom of the homepage, they can order the book from any hardcover, ebook, audio. The audiobook, my wife and I read on our own. So if you like my high-pitched nasal voice, you can hear more of that. My wife has a very sultry voice, so that's much nicer. But and I look forward to coming on the show again because I have to say, for your listeners, you are one of the most informed and provide the best evidence-supported advice to your clients. I look through all the stuff you do, the kind of there's lots of people that are in your space, right? Going out there and providing health and fitness support for people. But I can tell you that there are very, very few like Casey Ruff that are spending the time going to conferences, talking to the leaders doing the research, understanding the science behind the exercise prescription, the nutritional prescription that you're providing. That you're a standard to which all other people in that field should try and hold themselves. You're doing a great job, a wonderful service for the public, and I think our values are well aligned. We just want to help people to have healthier, happier lives, and they can by making some simple changes and having a little bit of discipline, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, that is extremely high praise coming from somebody like you. And, it takes time and takes effort, and going to these conferences costs money. Doing the podcast costs a lot of money, but I'm with you. Like, if somebody buys some sessions or buys some coaching, like, that's fine. But more than that, I see that passion shine through with you. And it's the same reason why we put out this content as well. If somebody can take something good from this, if they can improve their health, if they can help their kids, if they can help their spouse, anything along those lines, it's all worth it. It's totally worth it. To be able to connect with you and have amazing conversations with you makes it all worth it as well. So, well, really,
it's a great community. The keto community is very supportive. Maybe it's because we're sort of all contrarians in that regard right now, but hopefully we won't be for too long. But wonderful people, a lot of whom you've had on your show. Amber O'Hearn, fellow Canadian, recently.
That's right.
You've had Gary Taubes on. You've had Nina Teicholz. She actually endorses my book too.
Yeah, she did. So
cool. Sarah Hallberg, who just passed away, sadly. Yeah. And of course our friends, my new friends, Coach Bronson Dant, and I was on Ben Azadi's program. Actually, both of them, I've been on their program recently since Salt Lake. So I look forward to seeing all of you folks again, and I look forward to doing another session with you. And we can let your listeners decide what they want to hear from me, because I can talk about
sounds great.
Anything related to ketogenic diets, all the way from cellular molecular mechanisms up to public policy, as you probably gathered.
I think that is a tremendous idea. We'll put that out there and see what questions we get. And we should have a very fun and informative conversation. I'll look forward to that. David Harper, thank you again so very much for everything that you do. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Such an honor. And this has been another episode of Balanced Body Radio.